Very good. So before I start, as I'm coming to you, I'm sorry I can't be there in Romania, really. That would be lovely. But I'm coming to you from Australia. And as is customary here, I want to just acknowledge the traditional custodians and caretakers of the lands upon which I work, and pay my respects to them, both those current, emerging, and past, who have been responsible for keeping this country so beautiful. And as a kind of testament to that, I think almost, if people pay much attention, not every morning, but most mornings, I take a little snap of the sunrise just outside our house, and here's one of them. So it truly is a beautiful country here. So that's just to say before we get started. Now, so new work in theory of mind, or perhaps old work, kind of what I want to do is see just how far we've got, or whether we've really got far enough to get away from some of the old pernickety problems. And really, so I've entitled this Where We Are Now, or Where Are We Now? And I want to look at the big, really, keynotes do this sometimes, but I still want to, and it's my predilection anyway, to look at very big picture issues. So to give you my take on what I think is, and always have tried to defend as a rival possibility to the mainstream approaches to theory of mind. So I'll begin by kind of motivating that, and then I want to talk, look more at what I think to be, let's say, the current contender or challenger, which I think really comes back on the scene heavily with the new development in predictive processing accounts, which I think are probably the most challenging in some ways, and yet I think, as you'll see as I go along, have their own challenges in others. So I will try to motivate the live possibility that we might still want to prefer some of the alternatives to the mainstream, not just that those alternatives are in fact possible, but really that they have some attractive features. So I'll begin with going back a little in time and space in just a moment. But just to get those terms on the table, one of the things that was a bugbear for me for most of my career is that people talk about the phenomena as the theory of mind. And I want to challenge whether it's a theory, as you'll see in a moment. And so if the very phenomena is described such, it seems a little bit like we've already decided the matter, right? But I take it there, and you'll probably well know this, there's a whole plethora of terms that people might use. They're not always neutral. Mind reading is another. Again, I'm not a huge fan of that term, and you'll see why as we go along. Folk psychology is another. I like it better because I like the folksy nature of that, as you can see from the Bruegel painting in the background. But I think other people use it as a term of derision, especially if you're Paul Churchland, because you think folk is bad science, and bad science ought to be got rid of. So it depends on what your feelings are towards the vulgar, as Kant would call them. And I suppose I'm with the vulgar in this respect. So what I could say is the phenomena, this is borrowing from Simon Baron-Cohen's way of putting it. So I think the phenomena is, or we might use other terms like social cognition and such like. We all, I hope in this room, probably already know what those options might be. But we're often, in a very broad scope, talking about simply our everyday way of, I'll stress this, understanding people, yeah? More broadly, everyday ways of interacting with and engaging with others, right? That's much broader than just understanding them, I want to say. I don't think they're the same thing, but you can put them under the same heading. But I'm going to push for the idea that there's different features to both. But typically, when we're sticking to these terms and understanding, we're in the domain of trying to make sense of people's actions in terms of their reasons, using a particular set of capacities. And it's worth spending a moment just getting or reminding ourselves of what I'm going to focus for the moment just on mind reading, but you could as the more neutral term here, but still not my favorite. And I think this will remind us of some of the very standard assumptions in the field when people have thought of this when they try to make sense of what it would be to be a mind reader. So I take this to be fairly neutral territory. But on a standard interpretation, to mind read or to mentalize, insofar as your social cognition involves such things, is being able to let's see. Is being able to do things such as represent a wide range of mental state concepts, minimally belief and desire, but perhaps many more too, and also to be able to represent the contents of such attitudes, and to appreciate, and I emphasize here, by some means, how such attitudes interrelate. This is where you might think, and this will be useful for us, the structural claims come in. So are we using our own minds to model others? Are we using theory because the theory integrates them? Or as you'll see, are we using capacities gained from our over time through our acquaintance and mastery of narrative practices, which is going to be my alternative position on this. So the idea is that there could be different explanations of how we come to see how these set of things come together and in what ways. But you'll notice that the first two claims really put some heavy commitments on if there is mind reading, then there must be representations of some kind, possibly mental, and also that these are attributed states, both the states themselves plus the contents of the states. Now, in the literature, conditions 1 to 3 can be weakened in various ways to allow for mind readers with less than full mental mind reading capacities. So mind readers who maybe operate with different mental state concepts and or non-standard contents, right? So there's a lot of scope. I won't go into that. People might want to raise that in questions. But of course, if we're talking about comparative psychology or animal cognition, this is a very standard place in developmental psychology too, where people will introduce and say maybe they don't have the full theory of mind package, but they have some more minimal variant. Okay. Sorry, I'm still getting used to this. Okay, here we go. Importantly, on the standard interpretation, to qualify as a mind reader of any kind, it is assumed that conditions 1 to 3 must be met in some form or another. So I take that to be the argument would be if we found that attribution wasn't going on, or the attribution of contents wasn't going on, or there was no attribution of any kind of mental states, but we were still interacting and engaging with others effectively, we would not count that as an instance of mind reading per se. So I'm taking that as read, but people may want to come back on that condition later. So I'm just going to remind you, if you're not familiar with it already, of the core features of the narrative practice hypothesis as an alternative to the standards. Because look, I spent a huge amount of time, a couple of decades ago, doing nothing but this. Debate seems to have moved on in some important ways, but in other senses, I don't really see this position as having left the board yet. And it does pose some important challenges to standard theory of mind views of different sorts. And the fundamental one that I really want to drag out at the end, by the end of this first section, is really it proposes that folk psychology is a matter of giving and receiving narratives, not a matter of theorizing. And that has some fundamental, makes some fundamental challenges to our whole ways of thinking about what the nature of folk psychology is. And so I want to motivate that concern before I turn back to look again at what features of the new order of theories of mind that say have emerged recently. So what was the big idea behind the narrative practice hypothesis as it was posited or formed all those times ago? It's that engaging in socially supported storytelling activities is the normal, maybe not the only, but certainly the normal route for first developing and structuring our folk psychological competence, right? So in the account that I would give there, it doesn't entail that everywhere across the world that folk psychology is monoform. We might find that in different parts of the world, different narrative practices dominate, and then we might find different components and different elements, different variants in the accounts, different types of mental states. If I had more time, I could take you even through some of that evidence to suggest that that may well be true, where, for example, strong distinctions aren't made between, say, states of mind of anger, say, and intention and such like. So the idea here is that you could come to more organically through different sets of narrative practices, different ways of making sense of others in terms of a different weave. And fundamentally, though, that the capacity to act for reasons and to make sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons is bound up with that competence. That's what it looks like. So that accountability and making sense of this in terms of that suite of mental state notions is something that comes only onto the scene. So the hypothesis goes, once you've mastered certain distinctive forms of narrative practices. And in particular, not just any kind of narratives. I won't go through this now, but I've done it a lot in the past. There are different types of narratives. Not all of them even feature protagonists with mental states as such. So there are special types of narratives, which I call there, just under that heading, folk psychological narratives, hence the title of the book, that once we master them, equip us to give and ask for reasons for action. And when we're able to do that, we have we develop certain norms and forms. We master the forms and norms of folk psychology such that we're able to make sense of others, and we know what moves are possible for doing so. And we demand such explanations or give such explanations in our everyday encounters. So the bigger, broader picture here is that this works in with sometimes called extended. I have particular concerns about that usage, but also enactive approaches that simply say that, look, we can find this in the whole idea that there are cognitive niches that have certain features that shape regularly the cognitive capacities of creatures. This thought is built on the more simple thought that animals create external structures that shape their environments. Spiders fashion webs, beavers build dams, and that those creations in turn influence and shape the animals that create them over time, and that kind of ratcheted way of thinking about how cognitive performance is played out over glacially over time is deemed to be interactive. And so what we've got is a series of cycles for developing cognitive capacities. But to put it, quoting Ramstead et al. From some time ago, in human life, the regularities to which agents are sensitive are densely mediated and often constituted by cultural symbols, narratives, metaphors. And these shape social experience and in turn are shaped by broader social contexts. So the idea here is that the artifacts that we produce, either in oral narratives when we're speaking or written narratives, those that become objects of joint attention, actually are part of what instantiate those capacities through those practices themselves, and through the kind of continuance of those practices, we gain certain cognitive abilities we wouldn't otherwise have. So that's the central background idea. And here I want to stress that folk psychology on this view then is just is the exercise of a skilled narrative practice. There's nothing behind it. Sometimes in the weak variants, people will think that the theory of mind is what drives and explains our capacity for narrative practice. It would take me another lecture to go through enactive theories and to explain why that's not necessary as a base. So the claim here is the strong claim is that, in fact, the narratives introduce these capacities in and of themselves, and that they bring something new to the table that wasn't there before cognitively. So it's not dependent upon a pre-existing theory of mind, is the very claim that's being put forward. If folk psychology just is the exercise of skilled narrative practice in which we make sense of intentional actions, then we do so by producing and consuming reason explanations because we've mastered those narrative practices. We come to understand what will be acceptable or not in most cases in giving or making sense of ourselves and making sense of others. Now, I want to stress that so far I've been emphasizing this is an account of a developmental account in the longer written book, and it's also a structural account. It's an account of where you get the structure of folk psychology from. So it's an acquisition account as well as a story. And in the original work, I even give a longer story about prehistory. So from a number of angles, the account puts us there. But now if we talk about the application of the competence, so that's about the structure of the competence and how we might acquire it. If we ask about the application of the competence, one of the things I stressed in those works long ago was that perhaps the most important principle I want to emphasize is what I call the horse's mouth principle. That is to say, in exercising our folk psychological competence, it's especially in one-to-one second-person dialogue, is going to be the most reliable, though still fallible, and I'll come back to that, way of identifying and understanding a person's reasons. And the logic of this is quite simple. If we're forced into a position where we have to speculate about another's reasons for action, we can, of course, bring a number of resources to the table. Here's where I think, not in structuring or introducing the concepts, here's where you might say theory could be brought into play. But these are third personal cases where you're not sure why someone might have done what they did, and you might engage in theorizing to apply your competence or to apply it to make sense of or exercise it in a particular situation. So here, if we're forced into that kind of position, you might say, well, don't you need to use theory or simulation in order to make attributions of mental states? So, well, for one thing, I just want to stress up front on this, they're just a range of heuristics. There's nothing particularly special about these. They're not the basis of folk psychology on my account, not the cognitive basis. But yes, you could, in some circumstances, make use of them. And I think an awful lot of the work that's been done in the field in investigating these questions, because they usually start from places or tasks in settings where people are asked to deploy their folk psychological competence. They then rely on theory or simulation. That may be fine, for that might be one way of getting at why somebody might have done what they might have done when you're in the position of guessing this or speculating about it. But that in no way shows anything about what is the basis of that capacity, which is one of the things that's often assumed in those experiments as well. So I think that's a place where there's a problem in the methodologies that are deployed. So I might, for example, if I know a person very well, use individualized generalizations. Those might not be theory. They may be well based on having a history of engagement with them and knowing an awful lot about the kinds of things they're likely to do. So I'm probably better positioned to guess where my wife might have gone given her usual habits than I might be for a perfect stranger who I don't really know what their interests might be or what their usual daily pattern might be. Similarly, we could amp that up and use general knowledge, common or idiosyncratic, but then of course our chances of success will go down, right? So if I'm having to rely on what people of a certain type usually do, where would I find a student to find a particular student? I may get lucky with that, or I might, be way off beam. I could try simulation routines and see what I would do in such circumstances and such like. I think we know how that might turn out too. Here's one, and I'm going to highlight it in red. If we can, this is my point, if we can get hold of the person, because we're not now in a prediction, we're not trying to make an attribution, we want to know why they did what they did, I can simply ask the person. And there, I think our chances of getting the right answer go up extraordinarily. And I want to touch on the nature of this exercise in a moment, because this is important. And just as not entirely a joke, we might also have tried another heuristic, such as astrology, to find out what they think on some occasion. But this, again, we can see the reliability we would anticipate would be much worse than the methods I've just described. What I want to stress with this little example is when mind guessing in a third person state, when I'm applying my competence, I already know what beliefs and desires are, but I need to know what it is you think and why you did something on a particular occasion. I might guess at this using any number of these heuristics. And as we've just seen, not all of them are equally reliable, and it depends on a lot of background conditions. The point that I'm stressing is, if the narrative practice hypothesis is right, folk psychology is not at root a game of mind guessing. I don't think that's its origin story. If we go back into the standard accounts, people will tell you often that mind reading capacities develop to enable us to have better social interaction. It's a very standard account of the history of why we became interested in giving reasons for action and explaining ourselves in these terms. One of the things the NPH starts with is it doesn't think that's a very plausible beginning to why we would have engaged in making sense of one another in terms of reasons in the first place. To stress the point about the competence again, you could just go back, and I used to do this in the early writings, look at the fact that Sherlock Holmes, who is perfectly competent in understanding people's folk psychology, used different heuristics quite deliberately. Sometimes he was a simulationist, sometimes he was a theorist. The question I was stressing here is that the core competence needn't be rooted in theory. You know, even the hybrid theories tended to say, well, the core competence was the theory, and then sometimes you use theory or simulation when deploying it. And sometimes, if you were an old school simulationist, you'd say the simulationist would say that the core competence was rooted in simulation, and sometimes you used theory as an additional heuristic. What I'm arguing is that if narrative is the cognitive basis for the competence, then of course you could use either of those heuristics in different third personal cases. But let's also not get confused that those third personal guessing cases could well be, and that is the hypothesis, not the primary function. That's not maybe why we came. They may be an additional, and as I used to call it, parasitic function on our ability to make sense of others for different purposes, quite different purposes. So then what would be the function, if not prediction and explanation as per theory? Well, a number of authors have had already skated the idea that reason explanations function primarily as normalizing explanations, right? We're not really seeking to make predictions per se, maybe in some rare cases, but often when we ask why someone did something, we're puzzled by what they've done. And there's a sort of, in narrative terms, there's canon in breach. There's the expected sort of thing, and then something they've done seems aberrant to us and demands a kind of account of themselves. And if that's the case, any number of things might require mention in order to make sense of X's reasons for actions. They could be facets of character, mood, larger projects, the content of this or that propositional attitude, and so on and much more. Because what you need to do is find the thing that actually helps to tame the curiosity that's driven by what your actions have just created. So crucially, more like historical explanations, these explanations do not aim at descriptive prediction and retrodiction. They're not trying to they're trying to fill in some understanding that's missing about why something happened and what followed from it, rather than in fact trying to make raw predictions and explanations of that standard kind. Okay, so look, I won't be alone, and that's a lot of people have followed up that work. At the end, I'll gesture to where you can find references if you're interested to follow up on any and all of this. But according to the NPH, then the primary function of folk psychology is not that of a proto-scientific theory. And one good way to think that it oughtn't be is this, and what's the special status of the fact that I give special status to you giving your account, I think is a deep part of our practice. Also, there's no further evidence that could usually defeat your account of your reason, although we can, of course, be self-deceived, and although others might press us about this and might raise questions about whether that's a plausible account given other things patterns of things that we've done, but it's not as if there's some fact that someone can allude to that would be an ultimate defeater. There is ways of challenging and destabilizing and questioning the preferred narrative that someone gives, but I don't think there's a way of actually showing that because they made a better prediction, that they therefore managed to get at the reason that the author of the action couldn't explain in terms of their own preferred narrative. We tend in the practice to give preference to that account, and that you can see if you're interested in the work of people like Richard Moran has a lot to say about this kind of thing. I think that's right. So yeah, there are many others, Victoria McGeer, Annika Feibeck, Sulin Lavelle, and Regina Fabry, who've worked on these kind of topics if you're interested, and to take it further. Okay. So now let me jump across to say something about what I take to be the NPH's arch rival and continuing arch rival. And it's, I once wrote about this. Is a bit like the Nazgul. These are the kind of bad guys that never die, because you can't kill off the theory, apparently. It always comes back in some new shape, some new form. What do I mean? Well, back in the day, there were at least two major variants of theory. We used to have the modular account, very much associated with Fodor's work, and that taken up by others. And Gopnik gave a very different account, one that was much more dynamic, an account of evolved theories that children themselves developed precociously through their early years and developed actively created theories. And those views, I think they started to fall on some hard times, although there are still people around who would, even today, I think, defend some modular accounts as such, but they have particular Achilles heels that I'm not even going to take us through at the moment, because I think they've been largely superseded, at least in terms of popularity, by predictive processing accounts that have come in their wake. And these sorts of accounts seem to be giving broad attention and getting a lot of attention throughout in cognitive science, partly because they can speak to so many different phenomena at so many different levels, and they seem to be giving us a fairly broad and all-encompassing account of what cognition is like. And at the core of this, they bring up a vision of cognition that's in direct conflict with what I was just describing. And to capture it in a quote, if I best I can, from Andy Clark, but you'll find some very similar comments made by Jacob Howie. It writes, Andy writes, quote, and here he's talking about an experimenter who's engaged in understanding some cognitive system. He says, quote, the experimenter is here in roughly the position of the biological brain itself. What I want to emphasize is what Andy's saying here about the biological brain. Her task is made possible by the powerful mathematical and statistical tools is to take patterns of neural activation and on that basis alone infer properties of the stimulus. And the idea here is it's this inference to some form of best explanation honed over time through interaction that with the stimulus and activity that is the core feature of cognition of all sorts, right? From perception to imagination to memory. And so and of course, social cognition as well. So the idea that started to grow in popularity around the emergence of these theories is that one doesn't have to be wedded to very particular modular accounts, but more importantly, I guess what I want to stress is if we take this core idea to be central to what is the very, if you like, almost the essence of cognition, then of course, that's very good news for theorists of mind for reviving the idea that what must be going on when we are engaging with others and making sense of them is that we're making inferences to the best explanation, which is a kind of theoretical activity. So that's where you can see it in direct conflict with the position that I was just espousing under the auspices of the narrative practice hypothesis. And that is very much the way that this is characterized. It's an inverse problem. You don't have access to the causes of your stimulation, so that from the stimulation you have to use that as evidence to make your best guesses and refine those over time to get at what is behind your stimulation. This, I suppose, and also now alongside findings that even very young children had been interpreted as mind readers or having some often nonverbal, what's called implicit theory of mind, from very, very early ages. And we could go through that literature, been through it a few times, and those ages shift around empirically, but they get to be fairly young. And long before they have any capacity for language, then this story that was just given by the predictive processing accounts seems to fit in rather well, because now it says, oh, well, if that's the case, visual systems themselves aren't language-based in any way, so they have the capacity to make these inferential moves. We have a model now that can cover all these sorts of cases. Okay. So that, I guess, raises the important question is, how seriously should we take the rough analogy then? And in which respect should we take it seriously? Because that's what's going to depend on the revival, I take it, of theory of mind counts as things are now on the new scene. If we take it very seriously, that brains are engaged in inference to the best explanation, then we should have a basis for our account. So we can raise questions which have been raised in the literature about whether the inference is explicit or implicit. Typically, you're going to opt for implicit here because that's going to cover the wider range. Whether it's conscious versus non-conscious, yet again, it's going to you opt for non-conscious, you get a wider range, it covers more phenomena, even in these cases. But the common denominator, if we're going to take this seriously, is going to have to be something like that there must be a contentful inference operating at some level, right? If I'm to make sense of claims such as, or take them at face value, Howey's idea that inference to the best explanations aimed at truth are what drives that cognitive activity wherever we're engaged in forms of cognition of this sort. Now, in particular, and I won't have time in this presentation to go through this in detail, notoriously, you may know that I'm fairly known for, at the basic level of cognition, arguments in favor of non-representationalism. So I would have a lot to say, and I have some things to say here, about why we should be skeptical and we should not race into the arms of the idea that brains are capable of making contentful inferences. And if that's so, that might put pressure on these accounts, and that's what I'm going to attempt to do what comes, and I will try to give that as a grounds for making attractive both the narrative practice account that I was giving earlier about what I will call the more sophisticated linguistic forms of folk psychology, but also finding a different way of thinking about what might be going on in these more basic forms of social cognition that don't involve the attribution of mental states or the giving and asking of reasons. Andy Clark has been trying to find a way to show that we could have peace in our time, as it were, between those who've been deeply engaged in the representation wars that have savaged cognitive science for some time. And so in a nice paper called Predicting Peace, the End of the Representation Wars, he writes, predictive processing could serve to be provide this kind of bridge between the theories, because it, quote, only involves representations that are action-oriented through and through. So the emphasis on action and oriented representations was meant to kind of be a kind of halfway house between these two positions. But often, as is the case when you try to find a collaborative solution, it doesn't work so well. Andy says, instead of simply describing how the world is, these models, even when considered at those higher, more abstract levels, are geared to engaging those aspects of the world that matter to us. They are delivering a grip on the patterns that matter for the interactions that matter. Now, I've made this easy. If you're watching the screen, I've highlighted in red or pink things that I find suspect, and in green the things that I like. So you could actually find in Andy, I think if you're in the middle of these representation wars, the parts exactly where you think I agree with that, but I'm suspect about the other aspect. In particular here, the big question, the key question is, why think that the systems are describing anything at all? What's the theory of content that gives us the grounds to make that assumption, or why even believe that that's the case? I'd say that, you know, when Andy was presenting these ideas, he was showing us that this is one of these rare occasions where we could have our cake and eat it too. My response to this is that cake looks horrible. I don't want to eat it. And also it looks like Andy's got a lot of it on his shirt there as well. So I'm not jumping on that train. This is a thesis that continues to be played out, and I think it has to be solved one way or the other if we're going to make headway. So in recent papers, it continues to be advanced that we're still trying to find the way in which we can bring these two views together. So the representation wars in a new paper, enacting an armistice through active inference, is supposed to be a step towards this, because it offers a, quote, mathematically informed reading of generative models that could accommodate both richly representationalist and dynamicist views of cognition. But I suppose anyone listening can see the problem. If you're suspicious for lots of principled reasons about the ability to deliver a naturalistic account of cognition and hence mental representation at a basic level, then you're not going to be happy about that component or aspect of some hybrid position, and you're going to want to push for a purist dynamicist account that doesn't have those elements. So that's, of course, exactly what I think needs to happen. Let me try to motivate that a little bit. So from my point of view, I think that we should be wary of modeling the most basic activity of the brain on features of a mindset that emerged only, apparently, with late developing scientific practices, and thereby treating it as if that mindset captures the essence of all cognition. If I'm right about that, then I would say that there isn't going to be a genuine threat to the narrative practice hypothesis or its compatriot positions. So all cognition, even in its most fundamental forms, is on this picture, on the predictive processing picture, cast in the shape of advanced logico-scientific thinking. And that takes us it creates certain hard problems for the people who want to press for these positions. And I'm just going to lay some of these out. So Andy himself recognizes that it's an important question to ask: where does the brain get the conceptual resources and background knowledge needed for, quote, representing information and making inferences in the first place? If we're going to say that it's capable of doing such things, what apart from the fact that the framework theory assumes that it can, explains its capacity to do so? His way of putting this is, it doesn't answer all of those fundamental questions, but he pushes in one direction. He goes, how does the knowledge that powers the predictions that underlie perception and action arise in the first place? How do we get into that position to make better inferences? And his answer is to appeal to prediction-driven learning itself as the solution. So prediction-driven learning, he says, exploits a rich, free, and constantly available bootstrap-friendly teaching signal in the form of an ever-changing sensory signal itself. So I want to give some attention to this proposal. I'll be quick, but it's important. He says, quote, "The world can be relied upon to provide a training signal, allowing us to compare current predictions with actual sense patterns of energetic inputs." So it's that comparison that helps us to make decisions and will give us some kind of error signal that enables us to then modify and refine hypotheses over time. And so this is described as a kind of, this is described as a kind of bootstrap heaven. The prediction task is thus kind of a bootstrap heaven because it all works so well. We just amble up those cloudy stairs. But, and here's where we get down to it, all that the organism, the brain, the system knows, so here we talked about the knowledge in scare quotes, about in any direct sense, are the ways that its own states, for example, spike trains, flow and alter. Okay. Now, there's a lot in that, and I'll come back to it. But on this account, the brain must try to optimize its inferences about the world, starting only with such slim pickings of the sensory evidence. But we've already construed sensory stimulation as a source of evidence or a kind of evidence that is, in some ways used by the brain in order to engage in these bootstrapping activities. Now, Clark stresses that the brain's task of generating optimal inferences about hidden causes, starting from minimally sensory evidence, is a, quote, formidable task. But I want to suggest it's actually, given what we've been what's given here, I don't see it's an impossible task. I don't know how this could be done, and I'll try to stress why I think this is the case, and this is the basis for putting a hard problem into the direction. So I think that the challenge here is quite devilish and deep, and I'm going to channel the problem, or channel it by actually highlighting something said by Alex Rosenberg, that whatever the brain does, it doesn't operate on states that contain sentences and are about things, facts, and events that are outside the mind. That's a sort of picture that we adopt when we assume this. So the challenge here is if the brain isn't already treating things as evidence and doesn't have the background concepts and capacities to advance hypotheses, then it can't treat sensory stimulations in this way, and we can't use it to bootstrap our way up into more sophisticated hypotheses. And let's see where the rubber hits the road. Clark is very clear that the term information here is used simply as a description of energy transfer. As he puts it, talk of information must ultimately be cashed out in terms of energies impinging on the sensory perceptors. And he goes further to say, information talk thus used makes no assumptions concerning what the information is about. So he's clear about that. But I now want to stress there's a deeper problem. Without an answer to the devilish challenge that was just raised by Rosenberg about where brains get the background contents for representing information, and if we treat information, say, as energy transfers, or even just, as I prefer to do, as just forms of correlation and covariance, then we're actually only entitled to a weaker starting point than the one that Andy just mentioned. And that weaker starting point, I think, puts us in a bad position. Reframing his sentence, I would say, information talk thus used can make no assumptions that information is about anything. Information theory, in the sense of just the fact that there is correlations, for example, in the environment that you might be sensitive to, doesn't yet explain that information, that one is about the other. So we know for that fully well from long-standing attempts to try to give accounts of representational content simply by appeal to pure information theories, which have checkered history. If that's right, then I think we're not looking at bootstrap heaven, but bootstrap hell. We're not able to, apart from applying a picture, imagine that the brain is already engaged in inference, advancement, and refinement. It may be sensitive, and I think this is absolutely the case, to all sorts of correlations, but we can't treat that as if this was an epistemic endeavor of the standard kind that scientists are engaged in when they are advancing and refining theories. Okay, so now I think we, in that respect, have three main options. Well, take the brain scientist analogy, come back to the beginning when they said that they might take the analogy roughly seriously. You either take it very seriously and give or either give or promise a straight answer to the devilish challenge, but that's your burden. Until that's dealt with, you really don't have a strong motivation for taking these accounts seriously from a philosophical perspective. They have there's always the worry that they may just be a way of talking and not actually get at the roots of the problems. Here's another. You don't take the brain scientist analogy too seriously. You back off that need and try to go down some form of mental fictionalist or mild realist path, so you don't have to overcommit to the analogy. It is just a way of talking. It might be useful in some respects and others. But now we need to have more details about why we should take then the idea that why would we want to think that making inferences to the best explanation or theorizing is the best way to understand all cognition, and how do we make best sense of which form of fictionalism do we want to actually adopt? I'd have a lot more to say there too. And here's the path that I would recommend. Don't take the brain scientist analogy seriously at all. Go non-representationalist about basic minds and avoid the whole problem. And I think that is a position that I think is both tenable and viable and an option that I should think would be rather attractive given the nature of this challenge. What does that mean for, let me just finish this talk off. What does that mean then for thinking about forms of social cognition that don't actually have all the features, the narratively based folk psychology I was talking about earlier? How would you then accommodate those? I think we can easily think that of infants and other nonverbals, animals, such that there are sophisticated social cognitive capacities in play. We might still think that the creatures in question are responsive to another's intentional attitude, that is to say, what someone is directed at in a specific circumstances and how they are so directed, so the action agent relevant properties of the situation, but without having to represent or attribute any mental state concepts or contents at all. So those sensitivities can exist without thinking that you're having to go through any kind of weaker theory of mind attributions in order to get those results. After all, in the experiments we see with infants, just to take that as a principal example, they're only ever sensitive and appropriately responsive to others' action-relevant, world-directed psychological attitudes. And we can understand those being happening in non-contentful ways and by non-contentful means. So that option is available insofar as we have a way of understanding cognition without assuming that it's always representational. So just a couple of caveats on that comment. There's a lot more to be said there, obviously, and that would have taken itself another talk or two. But I want to stress that I've called that elsewhere not mind reading, but mind minding, because you're keeping track of minds, you're attending to minds actively. And here I want to say that mind minders mind minds, if that's not too much of a seashells by the seashore kind of statement. The thesis is not that they only respond to bodies and behavior, outward behavior. They're attending to the mindedness that is expressed through their embodied behavior and activities. So that's one thing. The assumption is that minds are not always and everywhere content involving, that some attitudes simply lack contents. They have directionality, but they don't represent the world as being as such, which is an argument that I've made in many of my writings. And that defenders of mind-minding accounts, and I think this is interesting, can accept that infants form expectations about full-fledged propositional attitudes, so they can have expectations about those attitudes, such as beliefs, but they need only hold, that is the infants, that they only ever do so incidentally and indirectly without making full-fledged propositional attitude attributions as such. So what happens is that they will be systematically tracking perhaps someone's belief, but without the capacity, the concept of belief, or without being able to describe the contents that relate to that belief. So I can keep track of it without knowing exactly what it is that I'm keeping track of under those descriptions. So that is a non-intentional with an S way that a being might be able to keep systematic tabs on somebody else's mental states without knowing what those mental states are or being able to attribute them in any way. Again, if I were to take us through that, this is all related to a very specific modification of some of Millikan's biosemantics, which I'm happy to take up in questions, which is the idea that much of her machinery gets us a long way, but I don't think it gets us an intentional with an S account of mental contents. Actually, she agrees it doesn't give us intentionality with an S, but I think it also doesn't give us anything like truth conditional content either. But again, that would be a long account. But if this is right, this is, I think, what the best you can get from a naturalized theory of content, because I think Millikan's account is probably the best, but it actually gives us a basis for unpacking in technical detail what such mind-minding might look like. So that's the alternative spelled out in terms of a naturalized account of intentionality understood differently than is standardly taken up. Okay, so here we come to the final stretch. Does that give us some philosophical peace? Well, if we look at this, I think it is a way of making sense of some of the claims that some of the people who have otherwise endorsed predictive approaching accounts fall into sort of talk that suggests that we don't want to take them too seriously, just as embedding this account of inference making and inference development. So here's Friston in one interesting moment saying, quote, an agent does not have a model of its world. It is a model. The agent itself is the model. It's not creating models and testing them on that, more an activist reading. What it's doing is correlations hold, it's responsive to those. You could use it to model aspects of the world itself if you looked at what it did, but it itself isn't engaged in an activity of that kind. So when he's making that claim, at least back in 2012, he says, we must here understand model in the most inclusive sense as combining interpretive dispositions, morphology, and neural architecture, and as implying a highly tuned fit between the active embodied organism and the embedded environment. I just want to stress here that that isn't, for me, a model. But if you took a third-person stance on a system like that, you might treat it as a model of something else, right? So of course we can always do that. That doesn't imply that the system itself isn't deploying models in order to engage or make sense or engage with others. Coming to the very finale, Andy Clark, one point raises, why not simply ditch the talk of inner models and inner representations and stay on the path, the true path of an activist virtue? My question to you guys here, or the challenge back, is, given all that I've just said, why not indeed? Like, why not? We have that option. Why can't we go there? And in doing so, I often don't agree with Alvin Noah and have a lot of issues with his particular way of playing out in activism, but this is one place where I do agree with what he has to say. I'd say the world, and in this case, others, do not show up for us as they do because we project or interpret or confabulate or hypothesize in something like the way a scientist might posit the existence of an unobservable force. That's not our standard way of engaging with others. We can, in extremis, adopt those ways of engaging with others, but that's when we just can't get at them and engage with them face to face and get their reasons for action, or perhaps engage with them in ways that don't involve that in more basic interactions. So I hope I've offered you a way to get out of hell free card that you can take and use anywhere in your philosophical adventures, but also to have motivated how you might, or why one might want to prefer one of these rival frameworks over the other. But there's a lot to be done there. And I'll just finish by saying, if you really wanted to see my most up-to-date biography on this and a kind of sketch. I revised along with Ian Ravenscroft recently the Stanford Encyclopedia entry for folk psychology as a theory, and you can find quite a lot of discussion of these challenges more neutrally poised than in this paper here, and that should be available freely online. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks so much, Dan, for a wonderful talk, and I'm sure everyone's joined me in applauding your work.